we can infer that he embraced his destiny as an intellectual in that way, and he was in the place that he wanted to be. The dispossession of Australian Aborigines has striking parallels with the situation of Native Americans, but there are also significant differences. And part of it was that Aboriginal society really didn't seek much of anything from the white colonizers except to be left alone. And there wasn't anything basically that we had that they wanted. And the famous example of that is when Governor Phillip with the First Fleet leaves a whole lot of trade goods on the beach. The Aborigines pick them up, have a look at everything, and then leave them and walk away. So.
Did Australia have a system of residential schools where the young Aboriginals were taken away and sent to school?
Yeah,
Because
and outrageously so, very much against their families' will, and there was deliberate obfuscation so the parents didn't know where their children were. It was a brutal, horrible system, and it persisted till 1970.
It's the same thing in Canada. There were residential schools up to the 70s here with Indian children. But there has been, in Australia, as I understand it, there has been a Truth and Reconciliation Commission of some kind?
There is reconciliation. It's an ongoing process. We just had Reconciliation Week in Australia a week and a half ago. And there is a telling of stories, and there's been a formal apology by the government of Australia. But it's still absolutely people, the mortality and morbidity statistics for Aboriginal Australians are still disgraceful. The discrepancies are appalling, and public policy, has flailed around for the last couple of decades trying to come up with something, and still floundering, many initiatives still very controversial, still very unwelcome in Indigenous.
It's the same way in Canada. Yes, ma'am.
Hey, a question for, I know you have written books and stuff. What is the longest books you have written, and how long did it take?
How long do they take? It's a hard question to answer because you're always thinking about one before you start writing it. So with my first novel, I'd been thinking about the story of Eam, and it had been kicking around in my head for 10 years before I decided that I was going to try and write a novel. And do you count those 10 years when you're chewing on the material and the information or not? So if you just look at how long it seems to take between books, it seems like it takes about 2.5 years, but I don't know.
Are you a slow reader or a fast reader?
I read very quickly, yes.
You do?
Yeah, my husband's very slow, so if we get a new novel, we both want to read it, I always insist on getting it first because I'd be so frustrated by how long it takes.
But when you're writing, do you spend a lot of time reading?
Yeah.
Be outside the ambit of the novel?
All the time.
You do.
You read a lot related to the novel, research-based reading or things that you think might be helpful. The thing I read every day is poetry. I like to start the day with I get the Norton Anthology of Poetry off the shelf and open it at random and read a poem, and it's kind of like my calisthenics. It sort of loosens up the language in your head.
I do exactly the same thing.
Oh, yeah?
And there's a book out called A Poem a Day, and it's 365 poems, and you can read
That's cool.
and have your coffee with it, too. I'll think of you the next time. Yes, ma'am.
Geraldine, on behalf of Bethlehem College, I have great pleasure to see you here. I was a librarian there. Geraldine went to Bethlehem College, the college you mentioned in your Facebook. And the question I have for you, I have read, of course, all your books, and I have been instrumental in promoting your books in the college.
Thank you.
And so we know about you. You are the gem of the college, and we are very, very proud of it. It just happened to be that I arrived in Toronto 3 weeks ago, and I knew you were coming, so I'm very delighted to finally meet you.
Are you going back to Bethlehem?
Yes, I will. I will. I have retired from the college 2 years ago. Now, the question I have is, given that you lived in Bland Street, we know about Bland Street, and you were educated by the Little Sisters of the Poor to some extent.
The Sisters of Charity.
Sister of Charity, that's right, Sister of Charity. Oh, it's the same thing, isn't it? Similar. And given that you have written a range of subjects, but most of them deal with the subject of God, whether your education in that school had some impact on that. And so that's my first question. And my second question is that we are waiting for a book that deals with an Australian, purely Australian topic.
Oh,
Yeah, I just came back from Australia, so that's come up a couple of times. I think Bethlehem's a fantastic school, and when I was going there, the principal was a remarkable woman named Sister Ruth, who was just passionate about social justice. And I think that she was hugely influential. But I also had many wonderful teachers at that school, one of whom I saw the other night at a reading, my English teacher. So I'm very conscious of my debt to the remarkable teachers at Bethlehem. And it was a fantastic place to be. It was a turbulent time. It was the 1970s, and there were a lot of protests against the Vietnam War. Australia had conscription for that war, and it was incredibly controversial. And a lot of schools really cracked down on students expressing dissent. And Sister Ruth said, if you want to wear a Vietnam moratorium badge with your school uniform, as far as I'm concerned, that looks great on your blazer. Go ahead. So, she was a very exceptional woman, and there was a great dedication to women's education at that school, and the idea that women would be educated members and intellectuals, which poor old Bethia didn't have. So I'm very grateful for that. The Australian novel, I started one a while ago about Jane Franklin, who's a pretty remarkable person, and I didn't do it in the end because there was too much on the historical record, and I realized that the better thing would be for a narrative historian to write that. If there's too much, in this case, Jane Franklin had kept her own journal every day. There's no room for the imagination to work sufficiently. But I do have another idea, and it's about, I'm just a bit worried that when you grow up in a place, you feel a familiarity with the history. And there's a kind of well, obviously not for my husband, but there's a kind of a sense that you know it all, and you actually don't know it all by any means, but it's so much easier to rummage around in somebody else's closet than to tidy up your own, I find. But I do have an idea, and I hope to get to it if I'm spared.
some of us had different experiences with nuns, but I won't go into that. Yes, the microphone. No? Oh, I thought there was a question. Yes, sir.
Oops. People of the Book is one of my very favorite books, partly because the narrative is so thrilling and partly because it pays homage to the physical book. In the age of e-reading, do you have any strong feelings about the resiliency of the physical book?
Yeah, it's the huge question. It consumes all of us who love books, I think. I'm unsure. Sometimes I feel like the manuscript illuminator, working away at her scriptorium and doing the absolutely beautiful page, and somebody comes and says, "Look at this new thing." And they've got a broadside from the Gutenberg press, and it's smeared, and there's misspellings in it, and the alignment's bad, and you look at it and say, "That'll never catch on. They'll always want illuminated manuscripts." So I'm trying not to be that way, and I think for environmental reasons, the ebook is, a good thing in many ways. I think that there are a lot of books that are suited to be ebooks. I've got this whole shelf of books that were written about the Middle East in the 1980s, and maybe one or two of them are classics to keep forever, and the rest of them were great in their day and not so much now. And they would have, I wish they were ebooks because they're taking up a lot of shelf space.
Well, a lot of people do rhapsodize about the physical.
I love the physical book.
The heft of it and the smell of it and all.
If I read a novel in paperback and I love it, I go out and try and find a lovely edition of it to keep. So I'm one of the people who really cares, and I love to have my rooms furnished with books. My 15-year-old son loves to read. I mean, he starts to get a slight twitch if he doesn't have a good book on the go. But how it's delivered to him, he could care less. And
But the container doesn't matter.
And he doesn't have any attachment to his library either. He said, "You can give all those away, I've read them." So, I don't know is the answer, which is not very satisfactory. I just had a very encouraging session with Dave Eggers. You know who he is? And he is completely convinced that young people want physical books, and he's very much in the business of providing them and making them as beautiful as possible. And he says that that'll always be the case, and I hope he's right.
I was reading a story in The Guardian last week. There's a company, a publishing house in London, with 2 employees. And they brought out a new publication of Vanity Fair, the Thackeray, with new illustrations. It's very expensive and it's selling like crazy.
Oh, well, there you
Maybe
go.
people want quality in terms of physical books. Yes, sir.
I think it was Graham Greene who said that he has to write 10 entertainments to be able to write one really good book. I was wondering what your opinions are on the difference between popular fiction and so-called literature, and if you acknowledge that binary, where do you feel your writing fits?
I have no idea. I think Graham Greene was so hard on himself. And he was able to identify a book of his that was his favorite book. Very strange. I don't... I don't get it, because I sit down and I write the best thing I can write. And if I could write something better, I would do that. And, what kind of sticker goes on it, whether it's literature or it's popular fiction or whatever. I mean, I hope that literature and popular fiction should be the same thing, but I don't agonize about it, I guess, is what I'm saying. And, so when I got the Pulitzer Prize, a number of interviewers said, "How do you feel? Aren't you stressed out that you'll have to, write better now?" And I just gonna get up in the morning and face the blinking cursor and do the best I can. And if, it's literary in some people's opinion, that's cool, but it's more important to me that people read it and enjoy it and get something out of it. So,
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ms. Brooks will be at the back of the hall to sign some Brooks books. So thank you very much for coming this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.